Last time we discussed an Austrian antique that was dragged into the Great War, and this would not be limited to just rifles. Their first centerfire handgun would also remain in service through 1918. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is a big boy. This is the Austro-Hungarian Army revolver model 1870. This is the Gasser. Let's get a closer look. Weighing just a smidge under 3 pounds and with an overall length topping 12 1/2 inch, this is a massive handgun, which is fitting because it chambers the 11 by 36 millimeter Vernal carbine cartridge, albeit with a little less powder. Now, I am pretty excited to talk to you all about this gun today, but to get there we really have to take a few steps back and review some other names because this gun is practically a ripoff. This was, of course, perpetuated by one Leopold Gasser, born March 31st, 1836 in Spital an der Drau. Leopold was the son of Johann Gasser, a gunsmith. In the end, he'd amass 4 siblings, Michael, Maria, Anna, and most importantly, Johann. More on him in a moment. Now, Leopold grew up like most others of this era. He was born into a very basic education in his home village and being raised in his father's trade of gunsmithing. Now, in the Austrian apprenticeship system, however, he would travel to learn from another smith in his teens. While I could not find out who he actually studied with, I do know it was in Ferlach. Now, following his graduation from apprenticeship, he'd become a journeyman, and in 1858, he set up shop with one Josef Schuy out in Otterkring near Vienna. Now, at that time, Schönig's premier guns were clones of the Beaumont Adams system, and in March of 1861, he would apply for a patent on his own improvement of that particular style of gun. This was known as the Thorn. His percussion cap revolver had a spike set in each cylinder. This would cause the bullet to flare up a bit, sealing tighter and better filling out the bore when fired. It also created a nice little cavity for the powder to not be crushed. Now, the Dorn revolver was also unique in that it was a double action revolver all the way back in 1861. That's pretty dang advanced. It competed briefly with what would be the model 1862 Lorenz Cavalry pistol. Now, Gasser apparently learnt a great deal from his mentor and also provided a lot of help because he officially became part of the family when he married the man's daughter in 1862. I'll point out that her name was in fact Leopoldine, so Leopold and Leopoldine. Honestly, a match made in heaven. So, in 1862, Schuy would apply for another patent. This would be labeled as the Gasser-Revolver revolver. So, in other words, it has Gasser's name on it. I'd say he had a pretty big hand in it, huh? This is a fairly compact double-action percussion cap. It had a focus on easy disassembly, so you could get to the cylinder for cleaning, but also had a rear gate to set up the caps, and then it would leave them safely covered when you holstered it. Now, this gun apparently didn't do so hot on the market, and few were produced or sold, but, you know, it's a taste of a beginning for him. Now, this is the last we'll see of Schuy. I couldn't find any biographical data on his birth or death, so either Leopold struck out on his own or his father-in-law took a back seat. I'm unsure. Regardless, by 1864, Leopold was joined by his younger brother Johann in the business. Now, Johann had much the same upbringing, and while he won't be the inventor of our revolver today, we're actually going to see that he plays a very important role. Both brothers begin rapidly patenting and producing a series of revolvers different from one another, but both attempting to woo that Habsburg Empire into adoption. As we'll see, Leopold in particular was paying close attention to the Belgians over in Liège. This, however, is a Frenchman, Casimir Lefaucheux, who developed the Pinfire cartridge in 1836. These look a bit dated today, but at the time, they were high technology, a metallic cartridge with a self-contained primer. The Pinfire was a pretty big step towards modern ammunition. Casimir's son, Eugene, would actually take an interest in his father's cartridge And by confluence of another chance encounter, you see in 1851, he had traveled to the London exhibition where he met Samuel Colt and was very inspired by the man. Well, following his father's death, he would take his father's cartridge and Colt's ideas on revolvers and mash them together with a lot of his own ingenuity, and this would result in the Lefaucheux Model 1854. Adopted by the French, this single-action pinfire revolver has its own story to tell some other day. But for now, we actually care more about what came around in 1856 when Eugene Lefaucheux had developed a double-action variant of his original revolver. And yeah, that doesn't look super different, but you can pull the trigger and the hammer will cock all on its own and then fall. That's pretty cool stuff for that time period. Both single and double action Lefaucheux pistols became extremely popular with Belgian gunsmiths, and so this is where I have to stop and sort of explain something. Revolver history in particular seems to be full of open theft of design. Some of this has to do with the poor international patent protections of that period. A lot of these things were very loose, and it's sort of like what we saw with Spain later on. Some of it also likely has to do with the cost of policing a patent when the theft is so far from home. Whatever the reason, most good revolver ideas were simply taken in competition. So what we'll see is that a host of Belgian-made Lefaucheux pinfires come out of Liège, and among them is one that stands out today for our story. And yet that's kind of familiar from the start of our show. This is a double action Lefaucheux style pinfire with a fair bit of original styling and engineering. Overall, a distinct evolution of the design. As best as I can tell, this originates from the firm of Auguste Francotte, which was founded in 1810 by one confusingly named Nicholas Francotte. I am sorely lacking biographical or historical data for the entire firm. Despite being one of the longest surviving firearms names out there, renowned for their quality of work, the Francottes don't seem to have a lot of literature around them. I'm sure the mysteries are there to be discovered, best by someone in Belgium with archival experience, I'm sure, but they just weren't available for me today. There's so very much innovation that likely came from this firm, as they had their thumbs in a lot of pies. Anyway, our gun today was likely created by Ernest Auguste Francotte. He was head of the firm when this design emerged. Although from experience we do know Francotte licensed other designs from other inventors, major and minor names. They usually got some sort of billing on the gun somewhere though, and we haven't seen any other names appearing on these Francotte double actions. Now, likely going back to 1865, the Francotte's design, the one that looks like our gun today, had a very advanced feature that you can see in its profile. Yeah, it's that weird spring there on the side. That's actually a safety device. It is a hammer block, and as you know, these were still considered new and good ideas even after 1900 on the Colt and Smith & Wesson revolvers. I'll show you how it works in more detail when we actually get to look at this gun, just kind of keep that in your mind. Anyway, Leopold and Johann Gasser start producing copies of the Francotte Pinfire revolver at some point in the 1860s. In 1868, Francotte adapts his own revolver to a centerfire cartridge, and whether because of copying this or by his own initiative, Gasser would do the same in 1869, filing for an Austrian privilege on a centerfire version of the Francotte double action. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some unique features here. Assuming they did not know about Francotte centerfire, theirs is a new but very minor adaptation of the overall action. Realistically though, this gun is basically a flagrant copy of the Francotte work. Again, we know that the Austro-Hungarian privileges can be pretty weird. If the government sought to adopt something natively, they may deny foreign patents to be filed. These are wild days. Anyway, Gasser now has this big gun, and it's certainly more advanced than that Lorenz single-shot pistol and much more reliable. And he knows the government is looking to upgrade. Recall, they had just adopted the Verndl rifle and carbine as we saw in our last episode. That carbine also came with a unique cartridge. It was straight-walled 11mm black powder with a fairly light load, considering this was done so that you could have a carbine and a pistol, both of which Verndl actions, and using the same cartridge, easier on your cavalry. Now, I found zero drawings or photos of the Verndl pistol. They never seem to have made it out of trials. Overall, the gun was rejected for being too heavy, slow, and having a rather uncomfortable recoil, very high and over the top. Leopold Gasser likely knew some of this story as he was a supplier for Verndl, producing rifle lock components for assembly at the main Steyr plant. Even before penning his own privilege, he was already showing his revolver to Austrian officials, this revolver. Curiously, yet again, one of the commission members was Captain Kropatschek, who we've seen time and time again in the series. On August 2nd, 1869, Leopold Gasser brought 2 revolvers for inspection to the range at the K&K arsenal. They were both basically the same design, although one had a more positive and complicated locking method for closing up that loading gate. He disassembled and reassembled one of the pair and then demonstrated both at 50 and 100 Schritt distances. These are Austrian paces. 100 shots were fired in total. The commission was impressed and ordered 2 for further testing, although they weren't interested in that complicated loaded gate one. They wanted the very simple one. This process of 2 revolvers went through many iterations, ultimately settling on a final pair. So they sort of go with like, you know, can we get 2 like this with this difference? Can we get 2 with this difference? And they were just testing down the differences. In time, it came down to really just barrel length, with the longer having a slightly thicker grip and overall being a bit heavier. Both now had 6-groove rifling to match the Verndl so that they could be produced on the same rifling machines. While testing this pair, the commission also swapped ammo. Some shots were made with as-issued Verndl 1867 carbine ammo, and the others had their powder reduced down 30%. No appreciable difference in accuracy or precision was noticed, but recoil was much improved. Being able to get back on target was faster. From this point, it gets a bit into the weeds. They make various requests for minor changes, but one gun ultimately stands out, and it's this guy right here. Iron frames, iron barrels. We're not cutting it though, so they went with steel barrel, steel cylinder, still iron frame. And they went through the usual tests for accuracy, resistance to dirt, dropping, all that things. Did surprisingly well. So on August 14th of 1870, they were officially adopted with a provisional order for 3,000 units. From Kropatschek's own book, this is listed as coming in at 19 gulden 36 cruiser. I have no idea if that's a good deal or not. The ammunition would be roughly the same as the carbine, now reduced to 20 grains of black powder. While certainly a powerful cartridge for the day, some of its case length was filled with cardboard filler at this point, making for a big, slow round. To keep the revolver and carbine ammo from being confused, the pistol cartridge boxes were marked with a wide yellow paper strip. So with all that covered, we finally get to take a closer look at this gun today. Let's zoom on in. Whoa! This thing barely fits in frame. Look at that, folks. This is a large gun, and I don't have a small hand as is. I mean, it's a big boy. But scale aside, this is a pretty wild gun. I mean, we're talking about a very old style open top revolver. We're connected through a central pin here. I'll show you that in a moment. The curious things that make this sort of more technologically advanced are the fact that it is a rear gate loading. And I mean, that is the simplest spring in the world right there. It's just screwed on piece of metal that clicks over. But rear gate loading, we got a 6-shot center fire with a hammer that has not a rebound position per se, because what it is it's sort of a hybrided. Our rebound position is our essentially safety position in which this spring right here has now set back in front of that hammer and no longer allows it to go forward. So you cannot hammer this forward and have an accidental discharge. If we cock her through, pull her down, boom, that's where she comes to rest. So there's no rebound, but if we manually bring her back to sort of that rebound position, this guy will pop out. So watch this spring in a little bit more detail. I'll get you in an angle where you can see it. So watch the spring. As I go to cock, she lifts up. See how she's raised up? And then as I pull through, you'll watch her stay raised the entire time so that that guy can make it all the way down to the cylinder discharging. And then when I release, she's still up. Now watch what happens. If I go back to that position, boom, snaps right in, and now we are safe from a hammer blow. This is a drop-safe revolver, going all the way back to being an open-top revolver. That's kind of a weird mix of sort of technology creep, right? Now, other than that, we do have a single cock and fire and double pull all the way through, and she drops. Action revolver. Being a gate loader, she also has an ejection rod, and let me tell you, this is one of my favorite. Let me get that to a rebound position so I can, there we go. So you got to manually align the cylinder back here. There's no easy way to do it. You can hear there's no real click. It just sort of, there's a click there, but it's misaligned. You got to eyeball it. Once you eyeball it, you have to come up here. You have to release, I kid you not, this is a thumb screw. So you have to loosen a thumb screw. Actually turn the thumb screw, which by the way, this had already been solved in a different way by Francotte, but we're gonna go with a thumb screw sticking off the side of the gun. And then we'll be able to eject our casing, bring her back forward. And after we've done all 6, we can tighten up our very advanced thumb screw technology. I'll point out, by the way, there's not a lot of these things out in the collector's market anymore, and there's a good reason why. I mean, look at how fine this outside spring is that's flexing all the time. I mean, how thin it gets. And then how fine all this area that would be the crane on a swing out is. I mean, very small. How fine all these little bits are that you can snap off or break off if you drop it. So, you know, it's a rugged gun in the sense that it's not going to hurt anybody if you drop it, but it's going to hurt itself with all that mass falling on these delicate parts. So the reason these are so unusual in the collector's market is, yes, there weren't a million of them made, but also I doubt they've survived time all that well. So let me get her turned around just so you can see the other side. There's nothing really going on here. All of our feature set is back over there. There's just some markings up here that'll tell you it's made by Gasser. And as we'll see later, you might have some unit markings down here, although this particular gun is a commercial version of the 1870. So we've just got a Leopold Gasser production mark and serial number there. So I'm gonna get her turned back around. And we're gonna look at how to strip this guy because it was designed to be easily field stripped for its time. Now this all turns to a screw at the front. So let me get out my screwdriver and we will set her in and just twist her to the left. Now you may notice a hole on this guy right here. To the best of my knowledge, the reason that hole all the way through exists is that you could get these with essentially a D-link piece of metal wire so that you could just use the piece of metal wire to loosen this up. I suspect that was taken off a lot of them for A, snagging in the holsters, and B, aiding to loosen the gun up accidentally over time. With that guy off, that is not actually the attachment point, that's the yoke. It's keeping it from rotating because now that it's off, we can actually just spin this whole upper assembly here, and that barrel and ejection rod and all that housing will thread off. And by the way, it is a fine thread and there's a lot of it because it's meant to bear pretty much all the recoil force of the gun. So you imagine whenever you fire this gun, that cartridge is trying to blow this off the front and it's trying to blow that down the back. And so that's all held by this central pin. So let me go ahead and get this guy off. There's our cylinder. She does fire blank powder. She has been cleaned. You're still going to see some residue on my fingers though, because you can go at it all day and you're just going to end up with murky oil until a certain point, and we still got to be able to get this back out on the range. So there is our rear plate, our central axis for the cylinder, and that's it. So if you want to talk about, you know, very early centerfire revolver technology and still being able to get in and out of the gun, it's dead simple. Yes, you're missing out on some of the advantages of having a top strap, which is, you know, overall strength, especially on, this is an iron frame revolver, like presently an iron frame revolver in my hands that fires that big old cartridge. So there's some limitations there, but overall, we're seeing a pretty good technological step, especially for a very large empire like Austria-Hungary at that time. We're very used to them being a little bit behind the times, and this is perfectly up to date for 1870. I'm just gonna go ahead and reassemble this one on air for once because why not? I don't wanna make a mess slinging it around. All right, so that is your quick look at the Gasser 1870. Now, normally when we do these things, I like to take the side plate off and let you see how the action works a little bit before we turn it over to Bruno's hard work at animating. This isn't a side plate gun. This is a solid frame. So all the springs and everything are set in there in such a way that they're tucked up in there and then assembled. And it's actually kind of a pain to work on down in there. So we're gonna use his magic to get our X-ray specs out and see how this gun really works. Being a gate loader, this will take a little bit of time. But we can take note of that hammer block. A long spring with 2 lugs, the rearmost rests under the finger extension of the hammer, preventing it from falling. That is unless the trigger moves, which presses the forward lug outward, driving the rear lug out of the path of the hammer. Let's start with single action. Drawing the hammer back also lifts the rear of the trigger until the 2 lock together at the tips. From here, a gentle pull will drop the hammer, firing the gun. Now, as the trigger moves, it raises and lowers the hand, which drives the cylinder. A raised projection on top of the trigger also serves as a cylinder stop. Turning to double action, a pull of the trigger will raise the transfer bar at its rear, which in turn tips the hammer back before releasing it to fire. To unload the gun, we'll manually rebound that hammer, allowing the block to kick in, open the gate, loosen the thumb screw, and from here we just punch them right out. Alright, let's get this over to Mae for a test spin. Yeah, that's a big boy. So the 1870 was adopted and Leopold Gasser was going to produce just 3,000 for the army, but of course private purchase would be far more common than that, as the army required their officers to buy their own handguns. So his company was expanded rapidly and it became Leopold Gasser Royal and Imperial Court and Army Weapons Factory and Soft Iron Foundry. I should point out that the Navy would also adopt the Gasser, albeit with some changes. They didn't like that threaded barrel attachment and opted instead for something more familiar to them. Their best current gun was a clone of the Colt revolver, and so they wanted its cross-key assembly. So this Gasser variant also had a loading gate that opened upwards and ditched the thumb screw for the ejector, opting instead to just retain it with spring tension like a normal gun. The first Navy contract was for 300 pieces, but this rose to 463 by the end of the year. The price was 19 guilders a pop. A couple of things went weird with this contract, by the way. About half the first batch were rejected for weak springs. This was fixed and sent back out. And the last batch was delivered late because the Navy had switched inspectors, with their replacement coming to receive them a month behind schedule. They still tried to charge Gasser for this delay, but he obviously argued the issue because the guns were ready on time, they just had nobody to receive them. Leopold also tried to negotiate trading out the Navy's current stock of old handguns in lieu of cash payment for the new handguns. This surplus would, they're dated, but they would provide a pretty good income if he were to resell them on the open market. Unfortunately for him, the Navy said, no, we only bought a couple hundred of these and we still need the 1,000 or so or multi-thousand or so other handguns that we still have. We're still using them. With his gun adopted and production started, Leopold Gasser died suddenly and unexpectedly. Actually, I could not track of exactly what, but this seems to be a fairly common thing in this time period, probably illness. His wife Leopoldine would inherit, and as was tradition, his bachelor brother Johann would eventually marry her. While this wasn't immediately, basically from here on out, Johann is running the Gasser factory, and for the rest of our story, he's going to be the man in charge of what's happening. Which, by the way, it keeps expanding, and in 1873, the company would go public with Johann and Leopoldine holding significant shares. In 1874, a Vienna branch would be opened, and by 1879, some 300 workers were employed. It said that they could produce 30,000 revolvers a year, in addition to other commercial products like iron forgings. Now, let's turn back to the development of this gun a little bit. Johann would try to interest the government in a Gasser revolving carbine in order to replace the Verndl. This really didn't get much traction. It basically lost out to the Fruwith, which still only saw service with the gendarmerie and not the actual army. Another early post-death of Leopold design would be a scaling down of the overall Gasser. In this case, the effort was mostly led by Captain Kropatschek. This guy was really influential in Austrian small arms adoption and manufacture, time and time again. It's lucky we have even one rifle so that we were able to discuss him in a previous episode. Now, this time we actually have a quote. He said, "The weight of the revolver 1870 is so great that the transport of it is exhausting and annoying for non-mounted officers. This circumstance led me to construct a revolver at the repeated request of many gentlemen comrades, which on one hand comes as close as possible to the revolver introduced in the army with regard to its advantageous construction and efficiency, but on the other hand has a smaller weight and smaller dimensions." Yeah, he basically shrunk it and made it in 9mm, specifically 9.3mm. This was moving at a leisurely 716 feet per second, but it was a lot easier on the wrist. So all this results in a new, smaller revolver with a privilege filed in January of 1872. Approved for private purchase as the infantry officer's revolver, the resulting 9mm is pretty rare today. In addition to being smaller, it also sports an octagonal barrel, and after a little time in production, they also ditched that thumb screw for the Navy-style spring tension on the ejector rod. The price kind of depends on the decade, as these revolvers were offered through at least 1903. The original list price seems to be 19 guilders and 50 Kreuzer. Now, I wish I had one in hand today, but no luck on that one. Maybe we'll get a chance later, though. As far as the Great War is concerned, very few likely stuck around compared to the then much more common big boy gun. Now, turning back to what is the model 1870, it would see an update in 1874. You see, a major issue was brewing. These iron frames, they're bending, mostly at the back, peeling back like a banana. Albeit slowly and over time. And here on this particular gun, if we look closely, you can actually see some resulting cracking. The first indication of this issue was actually that the hammers were not making contact with the primers because everything was peeled back so much that it couldn't set down on it. So yeah, we're going to need a switch from the iron to steel, and while we're at it, let's get a couple little other things straightened out. Might as well go ahead and bulk up that frame right at the front, right where it meets that barrel yoke. In addition, the assembly screw was tapered so that it naturally drew the barrel to center as it was tightened. Also, this screw, which secures that cylinder axis pin on the side, well, it was obviously letting cracks form, so it was moved to the breech face. The new guns would be marked Gussstahl. This actually means cast steel, indicating the steel frame. It was often imitated on Belgian copies, many of which were not actually made of steel. Now, those are all the original changes that would make up the model 1874 as adopted. By the way, the Navy found this good enough to go ahead and take in outright, unifying the service revolver across both branches. Over time, other issues would develop, however, and we can observe one on our gun right here. So I'm going to zoom right back in and take this thing apart again. All right, let me get my screwdriver again. Don't forget that. And then we'll do the whole thing again. This is the most riveting form of entertainment you guys have ever encountered, am I right? So screw out, and then I'll do it for the main camera this time. We'll just flip this guy over and over and over again. And honestly, you could spin it a lot more haphazardly than that. I just don't want to drop anything and bend anything. This is the iron frame version again, not the 1874 steel frame, but the cylinders are the same. They were all steel, and this is what we really care about, is the cylinder. So bring this guy back down in, and you can see, if you look very closely, let me get the patented plastic and pokey. You're gonna take a little close look. I may even pop a photo for this, but there's some damage that's occurring right in between these cylinders all along the way. And what it is, you could tell, because I actually did it earlier in the show when we first were playing with the gun. I had dropped the hammer, and then I went to open the loading gate and show you something, and hear that noise? That is the side of our firing pin cone striking on the wall of the cylinder. And over time, you get some real damage that way, and it's very natural to do. It doesn't have an automatic rebound, you forget, or you fired a shot and she just gets banged around a little bit. So not ideal. And with the damage that was coming through at the arsenal level, the arsenal started to just go ahead and mill a circle all the way around in order to allow room for that to come across. And it doesn't really impact anything because that's just where the rim is supported, not where the case wall is supported. And so you'll see rings cut in the back of these guns, and then production started to cut rings as well, just to go ahead and save that time. Now, again, sadly, I don't have an 1874, but overall it's pretty dang similar to what we have today, just made out of a different bit of metal and a couple little different features. As far as the Gasser pattern is concerned, this is the end of development. There would be some more guns developed by Johann Gasser, and we'll talk about them in the very next episode just so you can get a look. But for right now, you really just need to know that it seems that Johann lost the faith of the army during some of his development period. The history is a bit cloudy, but sometime around 1880, the Leopold Gasser company headed by Johann basically stops producing their revolver for the government. That's all we care about for now. Now, it may be because they got caught in a patent lawsuit, or it may be that Johann was so distracted by creating his new gun that he lost the thread of making the old one and just didn't see the profit in it when he could come out with a new design with less competition from copycats. Either way, a man named Thomas Sederl, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, steps in starting in 1880, producing both for the government and more critically for export. On the outside, the Sederl Gassers are identical to the 1870-74, which is identical to this but being made of steel. If you paid close attention though, you'll notice two things stand out. They did not retain the cut in that back of the cylinder, and they have a different trigger pull. Now, I have not handled a Sederl, but they have a sort of modified two-stage trigger of sorts, an invention supposedly from Major Conrad Ritter von Kromar. The idea is that you can pull the trigger until the hammer cocks back, and then it hits a sort of half stop, and then with just a little more pressure, instead of this crazy amount of force that I have to apply this very heavy trigger, something akin to sort of that two-stage Roth Krinka trigger we saw, you give it a little bit more and she drops the hammer. Well, by this time, the Sederl Gasser, Austria-Hungary, was fishing for some other handgun. Like, they were buying these, but in small numbers. They knew the next thing was coming out. They did, however, have some difficulty because of the carbine cartridges that could fit into these guns, causing all sorts of damage. So they sought a way to deal with this by developing new ammo that was just going to be shorter in case length. If these numbers seem familiar, they are identical performance to the original cartridge. Basically, all they have done is remove that filler and shorten the case. This is retaining the model 1867 carbine bullet. It doesn't even have a pistol bullet. Now, you know, it's not a bad idea to shorten that case, and you can introduce a revolver with a shorter cylinder and not confuse it for the carbine cartridge. You get lighter, you get handier. It's all a great idea. Unfortunately, despite the new ammo, they never got around to actually developing a revolver for the cartridge. Now, like I said, next time we'll see that Johann Gasser did try to do exactly this to win back Austro-Hungarian contracts. Ultimately, however, we know he would fail. And instead, the next Austrian handgun would come about from his younger brother Michael, as we saw in our Rost and Gasser Model 1898 episode long ago. Now, not only did that gun exist, but in time we'd see a cavalry autoloader and two further private purchase handguns available to the market, not to mention some pocket pistols. So yeah, a lot of guns came out after the original 11mm Gassers. And yet plenty of these guys were still on hand when war were declared. Serviceable old guns die a slow death in a war of attrition. So originally the Gassers were issued to NCOs and cavalry. This is back in 1870. All the people who didn't currently have the Verndl Karabiner, also to Jaeger officers. Then you could private purchase them to go with your Verndl Karabiner or whatever. Service Gassers were dated first with a 3-digit code that was set over top of the barrel, and then usually we start to see them move into the WN 2-digit code like we're so used to with Austro-Hungary. And if unit marked, it's available on the left side of the frame, like I said earlier. This one, however, commercial, so I can't show you anything, sorry. By the time of the Great War, the Gassers had been displaced for nearly 2 decades, and while I cannot say for certain how many were in service, records indicate that at the start of the war, some 140,000 revolvers of all types were available to the K&K. I doubt the Gasser was the most numerous in this count, and its dated black powder ammo was likely not a priority for production, so use of them was limited to rear echelon action, particularly rail guards or Landwehr troops. But just like with the Verndl we saw last time, these guys would occasionally end up on the front line. By example, this image was taken on the Italian front, so while uncommon, they still managed to serve. There is also an element of private purchase, as these guns would have been exceedingly common in the hands of Austrian marshal families, even though they had not been officially produced since 1905. So a lot of them probably got walked to the front with whoever. Now, just for icing on the cake, we referenced Joschi Schuy. He has a Gasser-Revolver book that is amazing. It's referenced heavily in this episode, and in his work, he found at least one example of a Gasser 7074 with an Austrian service acceptance mark of 1929. So while I'm sure 99% of them went out of service in 1918, apparently at least one snuck back in. Alright, we have a lot still on the table for next time, but for now, I think we should wind this episode on down. We've definitely explored where this gun came from, being a sort of Belgian copy of a French idea, and then an Austrian copy of the Belgian idea, and then minor improvements to get to this point. Big black powder carbine cartridge, then dialed down to not necessarily blow your face off, although they still put it in an iron frame, and then they put it into a steel frame if that gets you the fastest possible story. So that puts us in a position now for you to understand what we're talking about when we go get Mae's opinion on the big boy Gasser-Revolver. Alright, once more we've made room for Mae, and just enough room for this big old handgun. So I'm going to hand that to you, and we're going to get Mae's opinion on actually shooting. In this case, very specifically, this is the Gasser 1870, although outside of materials, it's going to handle the same as the 7074. So what do you think about the big boy Gasser-Revolver?
Guys, this is an incredibly huge gun. I mean, honestly, look at it, I'm trying to get in the right plane where it's in focus for y'all, but this is a massive gun. And
yes, that is a very large gun. I am intimidated by your really big, I know, I have to spoil everything. This is still my favorite.
He literally keeps bringing it out every time I'm like, this is a huge gun. He's just like, really? And just holds it up every time.
This is cartoon quality. This thing still doesn't run. I want by the end of the year to get this thing run. I don't know if we can.
Between you and Mark, you two are just gonna make that thing run.
Yeah, it's very soft metal, so we'll find out. But I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you with your very big gun.
It is a really big gun. I'm sorry. I understand your perspective on that. Whatever, I can't shoot that thing yet. It's not in my field of vision yet. When I can shoot it, then I will consider it. How about that? Anyway, this gun is massive, obviously stated. It dwarfs my hand, it's so big. And the weight on it is incredible. Like, you can feel, honestly, all the weight is up here, yet it is quite interesting. Balance point on it, it's not too bad. Yes, again, you can still feel the weights up front, but the combination of where your middle finger's resting under here and the swoop of the grip and the knuckle up top, there's no question for hand placement on this gun, and it helps to balance this revolver perfectly. I mean, I can only imagine how much thought went into that grip. It is perfect for the gun for handling it, so that's awesome. Great job on that one. But yeah, for how big and how just, I guess, thick this gun looks, it's weird. It's also got a lot of thin fiddly bits on it. I mean, look at this ejector rod. it feels and looks so flimsy. I mean, you can even wiggle it a little bit. I feel like this is going to get knocked off at any point. And when I'm loading and unloading, what is this, a thumb screw? Who puts a thumb screw on the ejector rod? That's super weird. And yeah, I mean, it's just not the fastest thing to use. It's also, like I said, it just feels like at any point I'm probably going to knock that off because, guys, I'm me. I try to be careful, but come on, I'm a little bit clumsy. No, but really, seriously, it just doesn't really feel like it matches with the gun, but it's interesting. There's a lot of thickness, but there's a lot of decor to it. It's a weird combination of thick and thin on this gun. I can't really explain it.
There's a training disadvantage to some of this stuff. So you're talking about the thumb screw. May I borrow that for a second? I want to point something out very clearly while we have the camera on. I'm going to line that up. And you just put this back together. Now, it took 4 takes to get the loading segment, or rather the unloading segment, because somebody can't seem to retain righty-tighty, lefty-loosey.
I can retain it just fine. I've been unscrewing and screwing things just fine my entire life. But something about holding that and unloading it and loading it, I don't know why, it messed with me.
You have a 50-50 chance. You've been wrong like 90%. I think you've done it once where you've actually put it back all the way in.
The problem was I started to go the wrong way too with that take. You can tell for a split second I started to go the wrong way and I went, no, opposite. Yep. Opposite.
Yeah. So, and I can make fun of her all you want, and a lot of us have that ingrained in our heads if we've been, working the garage a lot. But realistically, not everybody, especially officer material, is going to be remembering righty-tighty, lefty-loosey in everything that they do. So there's a chance of just getting this backwards. It's not a very good thing to have a sort of binary right-wrong system for how to retain your rod. A rod that, if left loose when you start to operate the gun, can slide in and lock up the action. So the thumb screw really is a bad idea. It's not just like we're having a laugh. It's a bad idea. All right, let me give that back to you. So we've covered ergonomics, so I agree with you. It's kind of odd that it's such a dense, massive gun and it has all these fiddly bits on it.
Oh, but it's beautiful. You have to agree, like, it looks gorgeous, though.
Yeah, it's bizarre. I mean, you have a massive cylinder and then this very narrow taper right here at the front. And that, by the way, it just seems so flimsy until you understand that that's just a yoke and that all the actual retention is down the central axis.
So hilarious, this whole thing just screws up.
Yeah, we can have a whole conversation about the open top in a moment, but let's talk about actually firing it though. So you've loaded up your ammo, the pistol ammo, and we've gone to the range. How's this thing actually handling once you get to firing?
The sights on this gun, first lining it up, it is very tall. Like, it's not as tall as it could be, but for its time, that is a very tall front blade sight. That V-notch is pretty deep. It's surprisingly good for a revolver. I mean, and look at that sight radius, really long. Now, granted, they maybe could have put the sights like further back here, but I feel like if they put them back here, to me, it looks like they'd be a little bit flimsy in that area. So I'm okay with the placement where it's at. I still got a good sight radius because it's a freaking long gun. I can't believe they made longer ones at some point. But yeah, shooting, lining up my sights. This hammer, now, I'm going to say it's a combination of 2 things. One, my hand, I think, just isn't quite big enough for this gun. I really think maybe just a few centimeters longer would have made a difference for just my hand with placement for purchase on this gun. And 2, I just don't think my hands were strong enough. I really thought they were fine. Like, I honestly thought my hands had gotten a good amount of strength because I hadn't encountered any other revolver since the Rijksrevolver that I hadn't been able to manipulate. And even the Rijksrevolver, I thought I'd gotten better on that because I had a few times to play with it afterwards with my shoot. But for some reason, like this gun, it showed me that I still have more to do. It showed me that I still need to strengthen my hands a bit because I just could not steadily on camera cock the hammer. I mean, granted, I could it's just still pretty difficult. Yeah, it's still not the easiest to do. Also, I think it's stuck. Yeah.
Wait, you're resting.
There we go. Yeah, I was resting my hand on the cylinder. That's not going to help, is it? But no, for reals, it's still not the easiest one for me to manipulate, and it shows that I've got some training to do on that.
No, I don't have a way to take a measurement of this weight easily, but to put into perspective, we shot a Rijksrevolver 1879 single action revolver.
And granted, I've shot Rijksrevolvers after that the hammers didn't quite seem as bad on it, but
that's the game. We've actually encountered many 1879 since then, and every single one of them has had a lighter hammer than this particular gun in your hand. Mm-hmm. This gun has a hammer that is slightly lighter than the Rijksrevolver that we fired way back in the day. That particular gun, it alone seemed to have a massively heavy spring. We're not sure why. It doesn't look like it was replaced, but anyway.
That might retroactively have me be like, I don't want to blame the Rex revolver entirely for its hammer on that time, because I think I talked about in the segment a good bit in the May conversation back then.
Yeah,
so.
We're hoping to get like at least a minute of May out where you have a chance at a Rex revolver 1883 so that we can cover that gun too.
Yes.
And anyway, the point being is currently, discounting the fact that that was a one-off very heavy 1879, this is currently the heaviest hammer of any revolver we've experienced in the show. I would say in terms of general production. Again, this could be a one-off, but we have actually handled other Gassers. So I've handled an Ottoman contract Gasser, and it had the same sort of heavy hammer. And we've seen other sort of Belgian copies that have similarly heavy hammers. It seems to be something inherent to the design. So very heavy hammer pull for single action. Pulling the trigger on single action to me felt like anything else, actually fairly light. But you go on and walk us through actually pulling the trigger. I'm sorry.
Yeah, honestly, I would agree. The single action pull on this trigger was not that bad. Like, it was actually pretty smooth. A little bit heavy, but, you know, it was still fairly smooth. Double action, however, yeah, that was actually pretty severe. Like, I mean, I have handled, and we're going to be revealing a little bit, you know, of a future episode, but double action on this 95 Nagant, and, you know, guys, I've already checked it. It's clear. Not bad at all. Whereas this one, it's so heavy. I mean, granted, the pull through, it actually wasn't that rough. It was still fairly smooth most of the way, but it is brutal. Like, it is one of the heaviest triggers I've handled to date. So I definitely did not enjoy that. And then the recoil. There was actually a significant amount of recoil. It's a heavy gun. It's got a ton of recoil. Oh God, it's a massive cartridge. I mean, shoot. I can't put it past it on that one, but...
The weight of the bullet alone is going to go... And by the way, very high bore axis. Hold that up for a moment.
Yeah.
Like...
Look at that. My hand is down here. Look how high up that is.
It's a lot of mass on the bullet. There's powder moving it. Not a ton, but still a good amount. And very high bore axis. It's a high recoiling gun. It rocks right in your hand like an old cavalry style pistol.
Oh yeah, it's incredible. But I mean, I'm just glad we had the pistol loads for that.
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, for shooting, it was definitely an interesting piece. I did enjoy it once I was able to get the hammer cocked, but it was a bit more than what I was expecting, I suppose.
Now, a couple things to point out. Number one, I'm gonna reach down here. This Nagant 1895, for those who are not familiar, is very infamous for its heavy double action pull because of the fact that the cylinder index is forward for gas seal. We're gonna have a whole episode on this, but Mae's right. This thing is not a quarter of the strength required to pull that trigger. So hopefully that's putting some perspective on why there was definitely a little shakiness and not as good of a group as you would normally have with something like that.
No, I honestly was not proud of my grouping on that one at all. It would be, if I had the ability to continue to take this one out to the range to kind of make sure that I was able to get my accuracy up with it, I would, but unfortunately this one we're probably going to try to retire it soon.
Yeah, and then these guns, as you saw, slowly are taking damage over the years, being an iron frame specifically. If this were a steel frame, probably get to practice with it some more.
I mean, eventually they made them steel frame, but...
While we're on the topic of potential weakness, I would like to point out that, yes, these guns made it through most of their testing with iron frames in shooting the Verndl Carabiner cartridge with 30% more power. We took a long assessment of the gun and decided on exactly one shot, so I believe we can pop some footage for that.
Yeah, it was definitely a rocker on that one. Not something that don't get me wrong, you're expecting it to be a significant amount of more power. You're not expecting a hand cannon. No one expects hand cannon.
It is interesting to experience a very large, heavy black powder revolver that has all the recoil impulse of 44 Magnum. Like, it felt like 44
I've
Magnum.
shot 44 Magnum. That seemed worse.
Yeah. So that's shooting, right? We've covered sort of the worst of the best, I guess, but it leaves us with this last thing, which is that overall, neither one of us, and we both kind of talked about this before, we can't understand why they left it an open top.
Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense.
I get why it started that way. It came from a pinfire revolver, and the pattern just evolved in that direction. And I suppose the first few hundred rounds out of every gun, no real problems occurred, and they must not have gone very deep with it. But the idea of pushing a cartridge like this, and then, by the way, this gun's very advanced for 1870. I mean, it's probably the first universally adopted single and double action centerfire revolver. The Russians in the same year saw a centerfire double action revolver only for their Navy in limited numbers. So this is advanced. I mean, it's very advanced for its time. But that open top design, despite not being completely extinct in 1870, it was still in its latter days. We were already seeing guns with top straps, you know, coming left and right, especially for more powerful cartridges. It is very bizarre that they did not put a top strap on that, which kind of leads us to our next episode, so I won't go too far with that.
Yeah, don't spoil them.
So, what would you do with this in the Great War? Is this something that you'd be happy to have on your hip, or would you be a bit nervous carrying around the big bore Gasser-Revolver?
Guys, I know that there were some ups and downs with this one. I know it's on the fence. No clue what's going to happen. No, obviously I can't take this to battle. I just can't, because the size, the weight, the fact that it's not a top strap, God, I'm just worried this is going to eventually like be a DQ gun someday if we continue to shoot it. Like I'm honestly not really, there aren't enough pros to go with this. I've got so many better options with it myself at that time, available to myself at that time. I mean, you were saying before, like there were top strap revolvers available. So why on earth would I go with this? No, unfortunately, it's going to have to get a hard no. I mean, it'd be neat for my own personal collection, but I couldn't see myself taking that into battle.
I think construction aside, even if you only needed to get 24 rounds out of it and you didn't think it was going to explode, there's still a limitation for you specifically where if you don't have 8 hours of good sleep, a fresh start, and a couple ibuprofen in you, you're not able to pull that trigger all the way through.
No, it really is that difficult. And I honestly wish, I hope like the footage and the conversation we're having here today is putting the emphasis on that. It is not something for anyone weak-handed to handle, I can say, I guess.
Except for me, because I have big, meaty mitts. This is an Othais scale revolver.
It really is. It does fit him to scale.
I would take this into the Great War. Now, I wouldn't be too happy. There's more modern options. They load faster, swing out cylinders, better smokeless cartridges. And by the way, speaking of smoke, we use black powder that we can get down to a safe load for these that's commercially available. It tends to smoke more than actual military black powder. I don't think this gun was throwing plumes quite like you saw in our footage at the time of its adoption, although it still would have been much smokier than smokeless powder. I still wouldn't feel that bad about it. In terms of having a 6-shot defensive pistol, there's a couple things going for it in my book. It's single and double action. I think it would go off reliably. I would want the steel frame for sure. That's not in debate. I don't want the iron frame. But that long barrel, if you're just quick point shooting at something, I can't point at anything within 50 feet of myself and not be pointed straight at it, because it's just so obvious where you're pointing the thing when it's this big. Now, follow-up shots are very slow, but this kind of gets into that 45 AARP situation where I only need one round. I mean, one round of this 11 millimeter is gonna...
You can't argue with stopping power, but yeah, I still don't, I can't see that in battle.
I'm just saying if a horse came at me with a knife, I would use this gun to put him down.
If a horse came at you with a knife.
I'm just saying.
Gentlemen.
This thing does a lot of damage.
This is the man you follow.
Big, dumb, and slow works out for a lot of situations.
It works out for you.
Anyway. No, honestly, it probably isn't a good idea, but I still feel like I would bank my life on a gun like this. It's weird that I would. It's like the finest line. One step over and I wouldn't bank my life on it. Now, I wouldn't want to put 200 rounds through it to bank my life on it, because eventually it's going to stretch out of shape. But, you know, in a pinch, sure. Now, the problem is you have to haul this around, and after 2 days of it on your hip, you'd be fed up for it. Like, there'd be no way. But anyway, all right, so I think we've talked about the Gasser in enough detail, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it next time around, something very similar.
Spoilers.
Yep, but is there anything else you wanted to add about this guy?
Nope, I think I'm good this evening.
No notes about collectability? Maybe...
I already told my stuff.
Now, this one actually came into our collection. For once, again, we managed to own something. It took us a while to get the loads thing up. Speaking of which, thank you, Chap and Bloke, from the Bloke on the Range channel. They gave us some advice on the ammo, and it worked out very well, so go check those guys out. That actually came from their with Carbine episode. So, collectively, I guess we'll just put it right back on the market. You don't want this to stay around the house.
Someday we can have our own, but for today, let's call it a night and send her on back.
All right, guys. We'll see you later.
Bye.
Quick and dirty update, ladies and gentlemen. Number one, I want to thank Nick Stanev for all of his help with research on this and the next episode. He saved my bacon in terms of getting some things wrong if I had not been paying more attention. Now, number two, some of you are aware that Patreon is embroiled in a bit of a bickering match, and some people have decided to leave the platform. That is perfectly within every person's right to vote with their dollar. However, we do not have an alternative to Patreon available at the moment. One has not really emerged in the market. We really don't want to load people up onto a platform that's just going to implode anyway, like we saw with, VidMe back in the day. So patience, 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 and in the meantime, just keep on tuning in. And then third point, I would invite everybody to check out the fact that we do have a C&Rsenal Instagram page if you are an Instagram user, because we are starting to gently leak some data about a secret project that is coming up right after the first of the year. All right, have a good one, everybody.